Hello, everyone. Welcome to National Hydrologic Warning Council's monthly webinar training series. Thank you for being here today. And today we have Karl Winters from the U.S. Geological Survey presenting for us on identifying and preserving high watermark data. Please, if you have any questions during the webinar, please use the questions or chat function, and I'll read those out for Karl, and he can address them. We do post we record our webinars, and we do post them on our YouTube channel. So feel free to go there and check that out. You can see our past webinars as well. I'm Matthew Rodelbarger, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. So with that, I think I'll pass it over to Karl. Let me make you the presenter, Karl, and get started.
And show my screen, and it'll give me an option to go left screen or right screen, right?
Yeah, right now we're looking at the notes presentation view. Okay, now we just see your slide, so that's good.
Should be the presentation view right there, right?
Yep, correct.
Very good. We're live. Okay, cool. All right. Well, thanks again for the invite. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of y'all about the high watermark collection efforts that USGS does and our standards and protocols. And should I be sharing my video as well, I guess?
Yeah, if you'd like to. Some presenters have shared video, some have preferred not to. So.
Well, I figure if I'm given the slideshow, your eyes are probably there and not on me. But anyway, just for sake of saying hello and all, I'll turn it on for about 5 seconds and right back off so we can get through the slideshow. All right. So I'm the USGS National Flood Coordinator. I've had that role for a couple of years now, and in that role, really, it's my responsibility to do technical support to our water science centers, our field offices, training, and helping out with a lot of flood response efforts, coordination of flood response at higher levels as well with other federal agencies, partners, Corps of Engineers, FEMA, et cetera. But right now we're going to drill down into sort of the field end of everything with respect to flood response, and it all starts with identifying and preserving high water marks. And so by way of a quick outline, I'll be talking briefly about the purpose of high water mark collection. Why do we go out in the field and get marks? We'll talk about USGS standards, where you can find publications on that. Talk about the types of high water marks, how they differ in quality, where you'll find different types of high water marks, and which are preferred high water mark types, etc. Give you some tips, things to watch for, both in the collection of the marks and in the conducting of the survey. Talk about planning and reconnaissance, and that's really a big deal. I don't have a lot to say on it, but honestly, there's a lot that can be gained or lost, right off the bat if you don't have a plan going forward as you start to get out and do your flood documentation and high watermark recovery. Talk about flagging methods, talk about field notes, what those ought to look like, what they need to contain. And then I'll talk a bit about the flood event viewer. That's essentially a USGS database that you go in and look at a map view of what high watermark data and other data that we have for specific flood events all over the nation. A lot of these are coastal events, but there's others as well. And that'll end my part of the presentation. After that, we had a second presenter. Athena Clark was going to talk about some new technologies and new developments with respect to coastal flooding monitoring. And I'm going to give, to the best I can, her presentation as soon as I'm done with mine at the end of all this. So starting at the beginning, why do we need high water marks? And essentially people have been collecting high watermark data for centuries. We use high watermark data to document flood peak height at a point. That could be a single gauge, that could be at a structure. We get high watermarks even at our recording gauges to really to prove positive that the recording gauge is working appropriately, that our recorded peaks are accurate, and that the data are verifiable. And if the peak isn't within a few hundredths of the high watermark, then we probably got a problem. We either need to figure out what's wrong with the sensor. Is it a matter of the timeliness of the data? What I mean by that is the frequency at which it's collected. For example, if you've got data that's being collected at 15-minute intervals, but you've got a flashier stream than that, then maybe the high watermark might be a little higher because the stream got up a little further and back down before the next recorded data point. So that's one thing to consider, but we use that to the best we can to verify that our recording gauges are as accurate as they can be. We also get flood peak heights at bridges or other facilities. We use this for design for future structures, for rehabilitation of a structure. If a bridge is being replaced, the DOTs want this sort of information. Also use it for historical documentation for long-term record. Maybe somebody at a water treatment plant wants to know, over the years, how high does it get and when, and the flood of, 2006 got up to here, and they kind of make note of that as they're talking about what possible improvements they need to their infrastructure. We use high watermarks for model input. That could be anything from, FEMA flood modeling or otherwise. It could be, a starting point for a water surface profile, or it could be at the upstream end of a water surface profile. It could be sort of your calibration, your target. This is where it needs to, when we get our roughness coefficients plugged in and adjusted out, we need to hit this target because we've got data to prove that this particular flood, this particular discharge landed at 247.7 feet at the upstream end or something. We use it for model verification. I've mentioned already flood profiles. FEMA will document flood profiles in certain areas, certain streams. And so additionally, you can take flood profiles and extrapolate USGS stream gauge data upstream and downstream if you get additional high watermarks in the area. A lot of folks are moving into the area of flood inundation mapping and aerial extent, both with remote sensing and imagery, but also with boots on the ground, documentation of the lateral extent of water surfaces. And a lot of agencies are playing in the flood inundation game, USGS and FEMA and the Weather Service to some extent as well. And so you can find a lot of those products online, but we use high watermarks to really, again, calibrate and prove what these models are telling us. And the USGS uses high watermarks for the computation of flood peak discharge. A lot of sites, we establish rating curves to convert our stage data, our water surface elevations, to flow rates, the peak discharge, using a rating curve. And at some point, we run out of rating curve because we don't have real world measured data. Measured discharges in the stream, a flow rate corresponding to a certain stage, either because we just didn't have the opportunity to get out there once it reached a certain height, or we couldn't access the stream above a certain height, roads were impassable or what have you, or it was such a large scale event that we just didn't have enough boots on the ground to get out to every site. So be that as it may, cases like that, you still want to have a valid rating curve, up in those areas where you don't have data. So what do? We'll compute a peak discharge using what we call indirect approaches, a slope area, a bridge contraction, a flow over the road, culvert computations, things like that, theoretical approaches. So really, there's a lot of utility to high water marks. USGS published a standard, gosh, it's probably been 10 years ago. I don't remember the date on this thing right here, but the Techniques and Methods is a series of publications that talks about sort of how-to of a lot of different USGS methods, approaches. And this one is TNM 3A24, identifying and preserving high watermark data. And there's the URL for it, but essentially it lays out a lot of the standards that we use, and we're going to talk about a lot of this today, and some other things as well. But essentially the playbook, you know, post-event, as it were. Part of the published standards also, there's a new URL down there at the bottom there. That's a high watermark form. Once upon a time, we used paper notes, and I used paper notes for 20 years of my career in eons past. You know, going out, just collect a high watermark, flag it, and while you're on the ground there, you're describing the mark, telling what's the mark, where's the mark, you know, what's the point that I'm in a survey to reference this mark, etc. Lay out a plan view, because you might not be the person going back to survey the mark. It might be somebody else. So the plan view needs to be, you know, clear enough, concise enough. Descriptions of the mark, left or right of the gauge, upstream, downstream of a bridge, etc. Need to be pretty precise in that regard. But so that's what it looked like, that shot on the left there. That's what it looked like, you know, 20, 30 years ago. And nowadays we try to get things digital to the extent we can. And we've got a, you know, the fillable PDF there with all the same information. Again, high watermark, elevation, if it's known, the type of the mark, the quality of the mark, and we'll talk more about that stuff as we proceed here. Talk a bit about types of high water marks, and we'll elaborate a little bit more on these things individually as we talk about the quality of these things. But, you know, seed lines is the little small detritus that floats up to the top and gets its way all to the furthest margins of the inundated area and into the grass and stuff. And those are of good quality. Stains, again, that usually is something that requires a little more of a slow kind of a water, more ponded, or more of an overbank condition, less of a rapid water condition. Mud lines as well, similar. Foam is more of a, you know, you've got rapid water, you've got that foam builds up and works its way to the margins of the inundated area. It's a little less accurate. Debris, similar. It'll work its way over the margins, but it could be anywhere from fair to poor. Wash lines is actually a removal of detritus and debris, leaf litter, whatever, from the surface of the ground up to a certain point. And cut lines is actual removal of the soil up to a certain point. Maybe part of the bank is cut out up to a certain elevation. One of the things we live and die by with respect to high water marks is the accuracy or the uncertainty of any given mark. You know, it's crucial for our flood records. It's crucial for our computation of stream flow indirectly. And so we really need to have good information in our water surface profiles, and that's going to start with good high water marks. And essentially, we assign a quality, excellent, good, fair, poor, etc., based on what we, you know, deem estimated, of course, to be the vertical uncertainty. If it's within 0.05 foot, that's an excellent mark. We think that that's a real good representation of the flood peak. That one, it represents the flood of interest, and two, it represents the water surface during the peak. Good is plus or minus 1/10 of a foot. Fair is plus or minus 2/10 of a foot. Poor is within 4/10 of a foot, etc. The last one in the table there is at least this high. And where might that come into play? What if I had, say, for example, a piling that had silt lines or mud lines all the way around it up to the top? And so we know that it was inundated up to the top of that piling, but perhaps we don't have any evidence beyond that. how much higher did it get? We may not know, but at least in our modeling and for our documentation purposes, we can tell folks that it got to at least this point. So I mentioned the types of high water marks that we typically find, and here's a general categorization. I mean, certainly they can vary depending on the content. You know, a seed line is generally going to be excellent because it's a very tight horizontal line. You know, if you've only got 2 or 3 seeds, you know, one could certainly argue that it's not an excellent representation. But in general, a seed line is going to be an excellent representation of the water surface at the height of the flood. Stains are good to excellent. You know, one could argue whether or not there's any bleeding going on, et cetera. How crisp is the line? How still was the water in the location where the stain was left? Mud lines generally good. Foam is fair. Again, it depends on how crisp, but a lot of times there's you know, a fairly fat band of foam that is left, you know, in those cases. And you know, in terms of the vertical accuracy, it's kind of iffy there, a little speculative there. Debris is a tough one. Now, I've seen people rate debris as good or fair, but you know, I would suggest that 9 times out of 10, debris is probably going to be a poor mark. You know, it could be anything from coarser limbs and stuff, you know, just random trash that floats around and works its way to the flood margin. You know, on the sloping bank there. But with a debris line, if you can get in up on the upslope part and find the smallest, you know, finest particles, you can get a better high water mark from debris. Wash lines generally poor because they usually, you'll find they kind of wave up and down on the sloping bank there, but we'll talk about that more in a bit. Cut lines, again, similar, fair to poor. So here's just some pictorial examples and a little more embellishing of the you know, the qualities of these particular marks. Again, seed lines, you see how crisp that line is on the galvanized surface there. And even this one on the screen line, you know, you see it on the exterior of the siding, but then also across the screening there. So it sort of verifies itself. And this picture on the right, this is one thing I really wanted to emphasize with respect to quality. It's not just, you know, the appearance of a given single mark, say the photo on the upper left there, you know, that looks like a nice crisp line. But now look at the photo on the right, and you've got, you know, all the way around this bathroom stall and on the back wall, you got multiple indications of evidence all telling the same story, and they're all telling the same story, and that just gives you so much comfort that, yeah, that indeed is the height of the flood right there. Stains, you know, they could be pretty good. Maybe got a few seeds in with the stain there, but be careful, you know, depending on the surface that it's sitting on, you may experience wicking, like if you're on sheetrock or some kind of you know, wood paneling or whatever. You know, a lot of times the stain may bleed its way upward, capillary action or something like that. But you know, my point is that upper line is probably nothing that you want to deal with at all, but rather anything that's substantiated by a little bit of more solid evidence. In this case, an accompanying seed line. So stains, and look at the picture on the right-hand side. You know, you see the discoloration in the painted concrete wall there, and that's a good evidence of a pretty solid high water mark there. Mud lines, very similar. You know, you got discoloration up to a point, and then it stops. So again, depending on the, you know, the tightness of the line and how much agreement you have between the different peaks, if you will, on that mud line, I would say this is probably an excellent mark. Foam lines, this one's pretty good for a foam line, although, you know, sometimes they're fatter than that, you know, a little more width in the vertical direction, and then they can become pretty speculative. You know, in this case, I would suggest that's a good mark. And again, it shows good consistency in its elevation all the way around the corner of this pier here. Debris can be the tricky one. Again, here we got a debris line on a sloping embankment, and here's one on a little flatter surface. And sometimes you see on those flatter surfaces, look in the photo on the right, sometimes that debris will really scatter itself out and spread out as it starts to run out of a solid wall to run into. That's where it gets a little sketchier. On this left-hand photo, where would you pick where would you call the height of that high water mark? We certainly have a pile of debris that's kind of mounding up, if you will, running maybe about a few inches to the left of the right flood margin there. But I would suggest, rather than looking strictly at the height of the debris, I would go into the little stubbles of grass, the blades of grass, and go in deep up against the soil there and see if you can find any evidence of fine seeds. They'll creep their way into the grass, and it doesn't take many to sort of confirm that, yeah, there's a nice fine line that might show up, maybe 4, 5, 6, 8 inches to the right of that debris pile that really might show agreement with, say, for example, the crown of that debris pile. But that debris line, even though it has a crown, that crown can be real speculative. A lot of times debris will float on debris, and so you can't say that it was at least this high when some of that stuff piles up on itself. So it's a little trickier there. Here's a wash line, and wash lines, again, depending on the slope of the bank, and really depending on kind of the waviness, what's going on with the how violent or volatile is the flow at that area. You may end up with sort of a much wavier wash line, and that would be less accurate, certainly. But a wash line can be fair if it's pretty tight, pretty solid, and if you're in more of a sheltered environment, less wave action and wind and such. When you mark these things, here we got a stake plugged in the ground. Look at the one on the right-hand side. I would suggest in this case, of course, it's the foot of that stake, where the stake meets the ground surface, that would be the height of the flood mark. In some cases, if you want to be a little more fine-tuned in terms of describing that elevation, you might drive the stake, say, 5, 6, 8 inches streamward from the edge of water, and drive it down until the top of the stake. Drive it down until the top of the stake is level with the high water mark at the edge of the flow. But then, of course, in your notes, you'll be describing that and say it's the top of the stake, or it's where the stake meets the ground, or whatever. But that way, you're very descriptive, and the surveyor knows what they're shooting. In this case here on the left-hand side, it looks like they put a horizontal black line that they're saying represents the flood peak there. Here's cut lines. Again, it's where some of the bank material has actually been eroded, and they can be, that's with wash lines, they can be sort of challenging, less accurate, and a little more up and down, vertically as you go through. Also wanted to just make a note here while we're talking about, the way they've flagged these things. I'll probably give a nod to it, I think, later in the presentation, but when you're flagging marks, consider whether or not the method you're using, maybe they got a 16 penny nail with some pink flag in here in a wall of sand, is that resilient enough that if you're going to disappear, go away for 2 weeks, and maybe another crew is going to come out and try to find this thing, are you sure that flagging, that nail is stable enough where you put it, that it's going to last and be there in 2 weeks and be stable? I want to talk about engineered high water marks. Of course, we can find natural high water marks in so many environments, but a lot of times we want to make it easier on ourselves. There's a couple of uses for these crest stage gauges. One is, I'd already mentioned earlier, that we like to have verification or validation of the real world flood peak at our stream gauge locations. And so at our stream gauge, a lot of times we'll have a co-located crest stage gauge, the non-recording gauge that's just a pipe and a stick. You see the little schematic there. It's a galvanized 2-inch pipe. It's got a vented cap at the bottom. It's actually a specially designed cap that it's got, like, I think 5 holes facing upstream. And you see the little the little circle there in the schematic represents the cross section of it. So you see a number of holes facing upstream, and what that does is that sort of alleviates any velocity head or buildup from the flow velocity within the pipe. And then you've just got a vertical wooden stick or a galvanized stick and some granulated cork in the bottom of that thing. And essentially, it's sort of an automated high water mark. Water comes by, gets up so high, gets halfway up the pipe, and goes back down. And you come back a couple of weeks later, take the cap off, take the stick out. You're either measuring up from the bottom or you're measuring down from the top, depending on how you've surveyed the thing in to a known elevation. And now you've got a high water mark, a granulated. You see the cork line on that far right-hand picture. You see the cork line rise up to a certain elevation, and that's the peak water surface during the flood. So essentially, we've got an automated high water mark recording device there. Clean off the cork, pour in fresh granulated cork if you need to, reset the thing, and it's ready to go for the next flood. In some cases, the third picture over from the left, you see this long crest stage gauge, about 16 feet long, spans the height of the bridge. And so it's kind of a catch-all for all the high water marks. And in this other case on the left, you see they have staggered high water marks on a single tree. Sometimes you might put them on like a 4x6 post and see a series of crest stage gauges going up a tall bank. Maybe there's 3 or 4 crest stage gauges. And you don't really need to check them all every trip or every visit, but you could, just knowing about what height the flood got to, you say, well, I need to check my lower 2 CSGs this time, and go on from that. So anyway, this is a good tool for, just making sure you've got a high water mark at a site where otherwise you might be looking through the woods and weeds, and then you've got something recovered, but now you got to survey it in. But with the crest stage gauge, you've already got a known height of the top of the CSG or the bottom of the CSG as you prefer. Another way this is done, I think a lot of our offices out west, prefer this approach, but they use a chalk crest stage indicator method, and they simply put an anchor bolt in a concrete pier. They'll paint a clean surface just to make it easy to see things against the concrete, and they draw a chalk line. You see the little white vertical line, they'll draw a chalk line up there, 8 or 10 feet up above that bolt. Now when the water comes up, gets up to 8 feet, well, all that chalk is washed off, or at least, greatly discolored and diluted below that height of the flood. So again, another poor man's kind of high water mark, and it's a good tool, and it's again, it works like the crest stage gauge, but a little less infrastructure and a little less stuff to, the folks out west, they use this because a lot of times they'll have high slope, high energy, very clean streams. And so the channels, they'll get high velocity, and they don't want their, galvanized pipe to be hanging out there in the flow to get ripped off, by the debris and just the velocity, et cetera. So it's less infrastructure to be damaged and a little easier to maintain. And now moving into the modern era, we're moving more toward cameras and video evidence. And so you set up a camera pointed at a staff gauge, and there you've got, whether you're looking at the high water mark as the stain of the mud line on the staff plate, or just looking at getting readings from the imagery at whatever interval you're recording at, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever. And so you can get flood peak stages from the imagery. Wanted to take a few minutes to talk about some this cautionary advice, some guidance, things to look out for, things to be aware of, and to kind of take heed of. One thing that's a really big deal, and I've seen people have recovered high water marks and went to the time to survey it in, and you go back and look at the notes and look at the pictures, and you're scratching your head like, I can't use this, because it doesn't represent the height of the flood, and there's a lot of things we deal with. The big deal is hydraulic connectivity. And so, for example, if a homeowner says, I've got a seed line inside my kitchen, it's a beautiful seed line, come survey it. and you go in there and look, and you know from your recent experience surveying high water marks out, outside their driveway and down the street, that that thing's got to be 2 feet low. What's going on? Is it they got a little bit of water in their house, but the doors were closed. They didn't get enough water in there, so that by the time the flood started to go back down, it never equalized. The water inside didn't represent the outside. And this is a nice little gauge house structure. Nice little seal on the door there. And again, I'm scratching my head. Is it vented or not? It looks like there's a little vent I think I see in the lower left part of the box there. You can kind of see. But the question you need to ask in every case like this is, do we have access for the flow to get in? And then beyond that, do we have ventilation at the top for the air to get out? Just pressure build up in there that might, again, do the same thing to where the inside high water mark really doesn't represent an equalized normal water surface on the outside. Is it adequately vented? This could be the case in a utility box, the underside of a bridge where you've got, girders. If there's no, joints in the concrete decking up above where the air can escape, usually would be the case of a smaller bridge or something like a sort of a culvert sort of design. But again, if there's no venting on the top, it might be that essentially the inside high water mark wouldn't represent the outside real world elevation. Another thing to watch out for, and this is kind of a hyperbolic case here where we've got 10 foot of debris piled up on the upstream side of the pier, but really just to make the point that you can have pile up on the upstream side that where the water surface itself on the upstream side doesn't represent a normal water surface, especially in a high velocity stream where you've got, if you got 8 or 10 feet a second, convert that into a velocity head, that could be a couple of feet of pile up on the upstream side of a pier. And likewise, draw down on the downstream side of the pier. Just be aware of conditions like that. Make sure that the marks you're getting are representative. Something else to watch out for is banded marks. You got multiple marks on a single structure, and you see an example of that on the left. Some sheetrock, a bunch of silt lines going all the way up to a certain point. Do these represent multiple peaks over a single event? Or were they left on the receding limb, and we've got this highest one represents a peak, and then maybe it paused or there was a flush of overland silt or whatever into the stream at a certain stage on the recession, etc. But just need to be careful here. Look on the right-hand photo. You see the debris snag, and that might draw your eye, and then you see the seed line at the same elevation. So you might want to initially start flagging that lower mark, but then you look a little closer, look a little higher, you might see you've got another substantial mark above there that represents the actual peak. This case on the left with the banding, I don't remember if I talk about it later in the presentation, so I'll cover it now. What about the case of a single piling or something that's cut off, at a certain stage? What if we had banding all the way up? That water got up to the top of the piling, but you maybe don't know how much higher that it would have gotten. Some other things to watch out for: displaced structures. Is it stable? Might find a seed line on the door of a trailer there, but if the trailer was knocked off its foundation, you really don't have any evidence with respect to the actual elevation anymore. What about vegetation? It can be pushed over by the velocity, pick up some debris, and then bounce back up as the flood recedes, and you end up with an overestimated or an inflated height of the potential water surface. Same thing if you got a hanging branch, you can be pushed up and then drop back down, and then you're underestimating. So just need to make sure that what you're looking at is a stable surface, and that trust that not just the mark was there, but the whatever it's placed on, you know, whether it's a fence post, a wall, a house, a trailer, you know, a car, anything like that. If it's able to be moved, it was moved by the floodwaters, you know, just take caution there. Let's talk about planning the reconnaissance. We need to think first off, what's the purpose of this high water mark campaign? Why are we getting marks? Do we need are we just documenting a flood for the sake of history to say, hey, it got this high here and we're comfortable enough with that? Are we getting flood profiles for you know, a community or you know, a science agency, FEMA or other? Are we intending to do some inundation mapping or something like that? Are we doing indirect measurements? So there's a lot of purposes of flood profiles, and we kind of need to know, or of high water marks, and we kind of need to know what are we getting into going in before we start flagging. Where do we need marks, and at what density do we need these marks? And this image here is a good example of this message not being communicated. This is two different teams flagged the left and right bank of this particular stream, and you see one went in and deliberately went about I don't know the scale on this thing, but I'd suggest maybe they were getting a mark about every 50 or 100 feet all the way down the stream, and that was sufficient. And on the other bank, they were getting a mark about every 10 feet, and maybe down at the downstream end, it looks like about every 5 feet. And the point is, they were getting every mark. It didn't matter if it was poor or very poor. They didn't care. They were going to flag something. And it didn't matter if they already had 5 other marks that were telling the same story right there within 10 feet of it. They were going to get another mark just because it was there. So just be aware of the purpose for the flagging campaign. Why are we collecting the data? What are the data going to be used for? And how accurate does that data need to be? You know, certainly I could collect a dozen poor marks in an area, but if I think I would be better informed by 2 or 3 excellent marks, you know, in that lower end of the reach, than say a cloudy mess of 2 dozen poor marks that are maybe a 1.5 feet in variation in vertical elevation. You know, really stop and think about if you're serving yourself well by getting more marks in that case. Some general tips: stop, look up, visualize the flood. And this little example over here on the upper right there, you know, here's a coastal hurricane event, and the high water marks were really way up, you know, 12, 16 feet up on a power pole up there. And so it didn't matter that we had potentially mud lines on these buildings back in there, and silt lines, stains, and seed lines, and it didn't matter. Those were all left on the recession. If you didn't notice those marks up in the power poles there, you know, you might spend a half a day getting all kinds of information, but at the end, the stuff down below is really, you know, not worth anything to you. So stop, look up, visualize the flood. A lot of times you can see, if you step back and really get a good look across the creek, you know, on the far bank, you might see a mud line stands out in the vegetation that you wouldn't see at all if you were looking at it, you know, point blank. Flag more marks than you think you need. Flag both sides of the stream. There could be super elevation from a bend in the stream, etc. Flag the best marks, and that's what I said in the prior slides. We want to start with the best marks, and then if we get other evidence, you know, that's cool. If we don't have too many of the best marks, we can start supplementing with you know, some fair marks or some poor marks if we need to. But again, I want to start with the best ones, and then we'll go from there. Add as much other information as we can until we get corroboration at any given location. If I've got, you know, 2 or 3 good to excellent marks at one particular location, I'm probably going to go ahead and pick up my field bag and move on downstream or upstream, you know, another 50 or 100 feet and renew my search there. Avoid high velocity areas. You know, you get stuff that, again, bends down, pops back up, gets washed out, erosion and other issues like that. Really issues with pile up, etc. Also, a lot of high velocity areas just don't make good landing spots, if you will, for you know, seed lines and stains. The water's moving too much. Talked about the interior structures a bit. They act as stilling wells, so you get a nice calm water surface, but you really need to make sure you've got ventilation adequate to get, you know, conductive connectivity, if you will, of the flow inside and out, so that we've got equalized water surface elevation inside. I already mentioned avoid marks on small removable objects. Can't emphasize this first bullet enough. Get the marks flagged as soon as possible. Time is not your friend. It's usually raining at the time these, you know, floods occur. That's kind of what brought it on. And if if the rain sticks around for a few days, most of your better marks are going to start getting eroded. You know, seed lines and things like that. Worse yet, if you got a larger storm system in the area, you might actually have a second event come up and eclipse some of your initial marks, or even if it just comes up to within a foot or two of it, you might end up with multiple events that now we don't know which is which as we're flagging marks going downstream. Look in sheltered areas. Now that could be anything from a carport, you know, an open garage or whatever. But it could also mean something like this sloping tree here. You know, I'd mentioned that a lot of times some of our better marks, seed lines and stuff, are subject to wind and rain being eroded and washed away before we get out there and survey it. But look on the underside of a sloping tree and you may find that there's a lot more of a buildup of seed or something that's been preserved even through a lingering storm. And so we've got a good mark on the underside of that thing. Now, of course, you notice that it's not nailed on the underside. They got the nail over there on the side, so you can actually get a surveying rod on there a lot easier. Use resilient flagging. I don't, you know, whether you're using a nail on the side of a tree, a chalk line, a Sharpie, whatever, 1x2 wooden stake in the ground. Just make sure that what you're doing, that it's stable, persistent, recoverable. You know, because you don't know if you're going to be going back to survey that thing in 2 days or 2 or 3 weeks, and you want to make sure that it's stable and recoverable. When you're looking for high water marks, use a pocket level, this little telescope level, especially in areas where you're having trouble finding marks. I know that I got a good mark on the right bank. I can, you know, work my way up and down the bank till I've got my eyeball level with the seed line. And then I take that little telescope level and just rotate myself 90 degrees, look across the channel. And now I can see that that second boulder down from the top, yeah, that's about where the high water mark should be. And I'll get myself over to the other side and start looking at that elevation. So it really helps to narrow down the search and save you from going up and down the bank in areas where you're not going to find a mark. What about private property? A lot of times homeowners aren't going to appreciate you going in there and driving nails here or putting marks on this or that or the other. Consider measuring up or down from a stable reference, for example, a concrete pad, you know, front patio, windowsill, whatever, something like that. Just make good notes, take pictures, say, hey, the mark was here at this window outside the kitchen at this address. And the mark was, you know, 1.25 feet below the top of the windowsill. Take good notes. Every mark gets its own unique ID. In this case, our format is typically something like in the picture RH8, or in the example notes there, LH1, the left hand or the right hand, first mark, second mark, etc. Append the quality or the uncertainty. Again, in USGS terminology, when we say fair, that automatically tells us that it's plus or minus, you know, 1 A lot of times it's helpful to append the height above ground. It helps the surveyor recover it. If I know I need to be looking somewhere 3 feet above ground, well, that's where I'm going to start my search, and I won't waste time looking down at the foot of the ground or 6 feet above the ground. So put the height above ground there. It's also informative for folks like FEMA. They use that information as well in their modeling. Give a lat long, and hopefully GPS provide that information, or a detailed description at the very least. 25 feet downstream from the left abutment of the bridge or something like that. Describe the marker type, survey point. Provide plan view sketches, show where they are all relative to certain features, relative to the bridge, relative to a gauge, relative to a facility. Take photos of the mark, take photos of the environments, and it also helps to step back and take a picture, kind of the approach to the mark, so that, again, it might not be you that's coming back to survey the thing, but if somebody can get a few reference points in the picture, they know exactly where they need to be looking. And I'd mentioned before, once upon a time, we used to take notes on paper, and a lot of this stuff has been automated, digitized here, and so we've got PDF forms, etc., available. We talk about specific marks in the descriptions. Surveying tips: our goal is 1/100th of a foot vertical accuracy. So as we're doing the survey, make sure that any hubs we're setting up, that we're trying to maintain that sort of accuracy as we turn from hub to hub. If you're using a GPS, make sure you've done enough due diligence with error checks, etc., and residence time, occupation time, etc., to dial in your accuracy a little better. For total station, we use reciprocal level loops. That means we start at a hub, survey what we're going to survey, close on that hub, and then we shoot to the next hub, and we'll run a second loop. And so every time we run to another hub, we're closing as we go. So we automatically know what our error is, and we're able to adjust out our error before we even start the next loop. Here's a little tip in this photograph. Again, using a total station. He's using a 0 rod height. He puts the prism right there on that little seed line on the window. And so the instrument person is a keen instrument person is not going to target the height on the middle of the prism. Rather, they're actually going to target through the optic that high water mark. And you can see the high water mark directly, and then maybe scoot it over a little bit horizontally to ping off the prism there. But that way you've got a really good representation of the height of the mark. What about high water mark needs for specific hydraulic computations? And I didn't include step back water in here, but one could argue that same thing sort of there. In terms of calibration, getting high water marks at the downstream, upstream end of a reach. But for a slope area measurement, we want to make sure we've got plenty of fall through a reach. The model will run with less than 1/2 foot of fall between sections, but really it's set up to where USGS slope area program will bark at you, give you an error message, a warning, if you will, if you've got less than 1/2 foot of fall between sections. So as you're surveying flagging a reach, you really want to try to shoot for sufficient fall through a given reach. For weirs or road overflow computations, I recommend getting a tailwater mark too, even if you think that it's going through critical depth over the roadway. That disproves any possible effective submergence, knowing that we have a high water mark that's, say, for example, lower than the center line of the road. Contracted openings, bridges, get marks in the approach, 1 bridge width upstream. Similar for culverts, you want to get marks in the approach, 1 culvert width upstream. We get marks upstream and downstream at a culvert also to prove the flow type, various flow types. Where's the control? Does it go through critical depth at all? Does it go through critical depth at the outlet? Does it go through critical depth at the inlet? But a big deal here in locating the approach section is remembering that the upstream wing wall is not the approach section. And this is a horrible example here. We've got the crest stage gauge you see mounted on that left-hand wing wall. And so they're getting a high water elevation there at the upstream end of the wing wall, and that does nothing for me. If I'm trying to run a model, culvert computations through this culvert, essentially I need an approach section upstream. The backwater caused by this culvert, it's not fully in effect by the time we've gone from the upstream face of the culvert to the upstream end of the wing wall there. The backwater is actually going to occur further upstream as we get into that wider channel section. There's a lot of constriction that goes on between that approach section, say 15 feet upstream or whatever, and the upstream end of the wing wall. So we've got a lower water surface here than what's realistically suitable for the computations. And the same thing could be said for, if you've got a pressure transducer that maybe you've got operating at a culvert site. Do we want to locate it on the wing wall? Same thing. If you're using culvert computations to compute a peak discharge, you don't want that pressure transducer on the end of the wing wall. You want it somewhere in an adequate approach section. So where do these high water marks live? We have a little database here called the Flood Event Viewer, and it's a beautiful thing in that it's searchable by event. The first thing it's going to ask you when you go into there is, hey, what event are you looking for? And in this case, we've dropped down and said we've selected Tropical Cyclone Ida. And so Ida had a number of high water marks actually in the Gulf Coast as well, and here's a bunch of them in the New York area. The Flood Event Viewer also has information from wave height sensors, regular gauges, barometric pressure sensors that were used to calibrate any pressure transducers, rapid deployment gauges. Those essentially are full range stream gauges, but we've got them, deployed at non-routine sites. And high water marks. And here are these brown diamonds all over the place, or high water marks that were recovered in the New York area following Hurricane Ida. You click on any one of these things, it talks about the mark, the elevation of the mark, the height above ground, what's the quality of the mark, et cetera, its accuracy, lat long, description of the mark, good stuff like that. You can also click on a peak summary in some cases and get just a quick presentation of a bunch of elevations throughout the mapped area. And you can associate other information with these high water mark uploads to that database, pictures, field notes, etc. And sometimes you get lucky and your seed line is right there on your staff gauge. No surveying necessary. That's all I've got for this part of the presentation. We can pause for questions and move into well, I'll take some questions first, and then we can move into Athena's presentation.
Yeah, sure. I've got a question here. Sorry, let me just expand this. Okay, David Murdoch asks, what are the criteria for an event getting into the flood event viewer?
Can I ask, is that David Murdoch of LCRA or something like that?
I'm not sure. He doesn't listen to organization.
All right. Anyway, I knew one once upon.
Yes.
Oh, there you go. Well, hello. That's a good question, and right now, we're working to see what we can do about getting high water marks from other entities loaded. Tell you what, I'll get back to you on that one, Dave. Again, we are working with FEMA and the Corps and others on again expanding our capabilities with respect to coordination, collaboration, and high watermark collection. One thing we've got going on that we do during large events is we've got a high watermark dashboard that it's internal only, but what it does is it allows us to kind of pre-event as we're in the throes of planning our flood response right before the a flood, kind of, say, for example, we've got a hurricane inbound or something. We may divvy up a certain area and say, well, the Corps is going to be responsible for this quadrant, and FEMA over here, and USGS will get the rest. And that way we're not stepping on toes. And already from that vantage point, we're already planning that, yeah, we're going to be sharing high watermark information. Right now, I don't think we have an easy way for them to get their data ported to our flood event viewer, but we're working toward that.
So we have a comment from Kurt Zach. He has really good presentation. He said, can you share it? Kurt, just so you know, I'll be uploading this webinar to the National Hydrologic Warning Council YouTube page probably later today or tomorrow. So you can access it there. Let's see. Christina Bryant asks, how accurate are chalk crest stage indicators? Have you noticed if it is likely that rain will wash off the chalk during a large event?
Good question. I think most of these things are located at bridge crossings, and so it would be like on the pier of a bridge, and so you would probably put it like under the center line of the roadway. You follow me, so that you're less likely to get any impact from the rain. That's a good question. I think they typically run them under the bridge center line. But in terms of accuracy, I'd say it's a solid good mark. That chalk is pretty susceptible to washing off, and if nothing else, at least discoloring, with the rise of the floodwater.
Okay. William Wachschul, will we get a certificate of attendance? Yes, we'll be providing those. They'll probably follow a couple weeks from this webinar. Christina Bryant, do you find that chalk indicators or CSGs provide enough data to mark a flood line, or do you still flag and survey high water marks?
I guess it depends on the need. That's a great question. I would suggest that, like, for example, if we're talking about a single point, we'll put in a CSG outside of our stream gauges, and we try to have something like that in place at almost all of our routine, regular, full range stream gauges, recording gauges, just to verify the recorded peak height. We're comfortable typically that CSG is good enough and accurate enough in most senses. Again, assuming usually these things are like a 5 foot or a 6 foot pipe, sometimes more. But the point is, assuming that it covered the range, the height of the flood, we're good. Maybe it didn't reach the CSG. Maybe it was under the bottom of the CSG. Maybe it eclipsed it, in a large flood. In a case like that, you definitely need to go out and get a mark. But if it has a mark, that mark is usually good, and we usually accept that as pretty reliable. Now, in some cases, you also need to think that the CSG has to be installed in an appropriate place. What we say is it's in the same gauge pool hydraulically that the sensor of the gauge would be in that case. And as long as that's the case, you should get good agreement. But the CSG has been surveyed, the sensor's been surveyed, so we know that these things are both giving us what we think are real world numbers. And if one of them is consistently reporting, 2 or 3 tenths high or 2 or 3 tenths low, stop and take a look. Is there something hydraulically going on? Maybe the CSG is located at the upstream end of a pier and it's subject to pile up. Maybe it's at the downstream end of the pier and it's subject to drawdown. Maybe there's some other things going on with respect to horizontal lateral flow vectors or something like that might be affecting either the sensor or the CSG. So usually we try to trust them, and in some case, one thing a nice new tool that we started using just a few years ago to facilitate getting slope area measurements at some of our gauges. You know, in a slope area, an indirect measurement in general is a measurement that it's not as accurate as a direct measurement, getting out there with an ADCP, for example. But we use them at a lot of sites to really fill out the upper end of the rating curve. One thing we can do to plan for, if we know we're going to have to do a slope area, for example, at a given site because it's really hard to get to, it's unsafe to get to, et cetera, we'll put in a profile of crest stage gauges. You know, maybe one's 100 feet downstream, one's 200 feet downstream, one's 280 feet downstream, and one's 350 feet downstream. And there's enough slope in between that we're comfortable with that. And we survey sections at each crest stage gauge there. And then guess what? Now we've got slope area measurements every time it rains. As long as those cross sections are stable and you're maybe going to survey them once a year, you can run a slope area measurement using those crest stage gauge peaks. And so that was your question, Christina, is do we trust them? How reliable are they? You know, are they going to give you good, accurate data? We use them for, again, what we call continuous slope area measurements. You could even outfit the thing with pressure transducers if you wanted to. And we've tried that as well, where you've got pressure transducers in a crest stage gauge pipe, for example. And now you've got a mark, for example, and a recorded hydrograph. And you play that whole game in profile. And so really you've kind of got a series of measurements over the whole hydrograph, if you will.
We have a question from Brent O'Neill. Has or will quality photography replace sketches completely?
What was the first part of the question? How or will?
Has or will quality photography replace sketches?
Are you talking about like in terms of plan views, et cetera? I'm not sure. I know that there's a lot of stuff we're doing with, digital topographic maps, et cetera. So, I mean, it's conceivable there might be some apps that are amenable to kind of making notes, in a sort of a map view that includes the underlying aerial imagery or something like that. That's certainly something that folks are probably working on somewhere. I'm not aware of it right now.
Okay, I think that's all I'm seeing for questions.
All right, we can move on to Athena's presentation. Now, I'm still sharing my screen, yes?
Yes.
Very good. All right. I need to get this thing down to where I can, there we go. Uh-oh, what is that? I don't know what that is. There we go. Are we live?
Yep.
Got it, okay. All right, so I'm gonna muddle my way through this presentation. This was put together by Athena Clark, and she was planning on being here today, but wasn't able to make it today. So I'm presenting on her behalf, and we'll see what we can get out of this. Really, the point of this talk is to really elaborate on some advancements in USGS flood event monitoring. Athena Clark is the coastal storm team lead, and so what happens is when we have tropical storms, hurricanes coming in, it used to be primarily on the Gulf Coast and Atlantic coast, but she has in recent year or two been making forays into monitoring out on the Pacific coast as well. So here's a little bit of a synopsis of 2021 hurricane season. You see named storms at least up through Nicholas, and so she held coastal storm team calls with our federal partners and local agencies and entities and USGS field offices, et cetera, in the affected areas for, again, these named storms here. And some of them were pretty large, Hurricane Ida, again, being quite noteworthy. She's got a little blurb here at the bottom if you'd like to join the coastal storm team. And like I say, she's very amenable to, getting many folks on those calls as possible, for the sake of sharing information. She's got her contact list there, ATH Clark at USGS. So a quick synopsis, here's a Hurricane Henri. And again, the flood event viewer that I mentioned before, this is the data showing up there. We've got a number of wave height sensors. I can't even tell how many. It's probably something. Oh, they got it. 86, it says. 86 wave height sensors in the area. And all the way through New England, south coast of Connecticut, Rhode Island, a little bit of Long Island, Massachusetts. 16 water level gauges, 23 baro gauges, and of course those are for the sake of calibrating pressure transducers, vented pressure transducers, and 15 high water marks, again for calibration. Hurricane Ida, that's the one that really kind of split in two, had a Gulf Coast impact and then much going on up in New England. You see the effect here in the imagery on the left and right. You see the sand goes up to about the bottom of the step there. And after Ida passed, we've got 4 foot of erosion or scour, if you will, on those pilings for the walkway there. But again, it's a look in the flood event viewer, in this case, Hurricane Ida. So you see a myriad of high water marks up in the New England area, as well a bunch of wave height sensors, regular gauges, high water marks as well throughout the Gulf Coast. We use a WaveLab application to essentially filter the storm tide data. And so what we've got is, you see the gray line there, the big fat gray line. That's very, very sloppy. Every wave that comes through, every perturbation and every change in pressure is feeling it and sensing it, and so those values are all over the place, and especially subject to highs and lows of waves, peaks and troughs. And so we go in and we filter these things. We played games with filtering at different intervals, 1 minute, 6 minute, et cetera. And we think we've narrowed it down to where we've got it to where it's just about right, where we're not over filtering and not under filtering. But again, we looked at analysis of those, and the punchline is to get to that, happy place, if you will, in terms of the right amount of filtering to get rid of the what's wave and what's real ambient pressure, if you will, the elevation of that storm surge in there. We compare that to high watermark data where we can, and if we've got good high watermarks in a stilled location that is sort of telling the same story as that now filtered peak, the blue triangle in this case here, then we're comfortable that we're really using about the right amount of filtering. And so that's what this post-processing looks like. And so you see the red line is the barometric pressure. Barometric pressure, of course, drops as the storm comes through and peaks, and get all the filtering done, and we end up with a you see the difference. It's in the table there at the very top of the graph. The unfiltered max was about 13.5, and the filtered maximum elevation was about 10.3. So really, over 3 foot of difference between filtered and unfiltered, and that would represent the additional wave height, if you will, over the peak storm surge. Here's a little video here. We'll play this here for a second or two. Actually shows Hurricane Ida coming in, and I think there was a question earlier about imagery and stuff, and so we are working toward getting more imagery data and video data, associated with our stream gauges, and especially in the arena of flood monitoring and storm tide monitoring. So here's a little. Keep an eye on that that tractor over there on the right-hand side there. You see it's high and dry right now, but the water's coming in. The pole's bending, but it's not breaking. And I find it amazing that the camera worked its way through the system. And we may have peaked already. Is it going down now? And through the night, etc. And it starts to go back down. Maybe I can stop this. Okay, more of the same. So yeah, so we've got video all the way through showing you know, the incoming surge and the recession as well. Kind of see a little bit on the back end. There we go. So a snapshot of some data from Hurricane Ida in the Northeast. We had a riverine flood event in Philadelphia, New Jersey, and New York City. We had 22 new peaks of record at USGS stream gauges in the Northeast, and that was phenomenal, really. Most of our gauges will have, anywhere between 10, 15, 20, 50, 60, 100 years of record. And some of these long-term gauges that get new peaks of record, that says a lot for the magnitude of the event. You see going through these photos, making stream flow measurements, got a little ADCP Doppler there going on it there on the upper left corner. Picture on the upper right is Water Watch, showing sites that were in flood stage at the time. The middle right, flagging a high water mark on the low quarter of the bridge there. Actually see the seed lines there. Another high water mark, middle left. The lower right there is Water Watch, and that's a nice little page, USGS, and it'll eventually be going away as we start to replace a lot of the functionality in Water Watch in our new national water dashboard. So it's out now, but it doesn't have all the same functionality and features that the Water Watch page has. But this is a nice page in Water Watch where it shows current conditions and recent peak. In comparison to historical known peaks at a given site. So here's Brandywine Creek at Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. And that sort of middle blue, 20.99 feet, 21 feet compared to historic peaks. It was, nearly 5 feet above the highest maximum peak. Additionally, got new projects going on up there. Flood frequency, some inundation mapping, characterizing peak flow, and they're working on expanding an urban flood network up there. Geospatial coordination and support, and I mentioned earlier that we use this same sort of dashboard here to coordinate high water mark recovery between different agencies so that we're not stepping on toes. But this is really a good little dashboard. It shows inundated conditions, known flooding conditions. You see some aerial imagery loaded in the background on that lower right image. Current flooding conditions according to National Weather Service flood categories, etc., and a whole host of other links and data repositories embedded in this web page here. Our data folks are working on a lot of visualizations and new tools and toys to kind of communicate, some of our flood data out to the communities. And this little guy right here shows, kind of the ongoing effect of the landing of Tropical Storm Henri up in New England. And you see the onset of flooding through time on the right-hand graphs there, and you see how that it goes on through, which gauges got up when and what was in flood. And then I don't know if I can pause the dang thing right there at the end where it has some additional information, somewhere like right about there. Oh, too late. I didn't see it. Maybe there it is. I can't read fast enough. Anyway, well, you get the idea. Some new national products. Again, I mentioned the Water Watch already. That's been around for 15, 20 years. It's got a lot of resources in there. The National Water Dashboard on the right here, I told you it's just brand new, a little over a year ago, I think. We're working on getting a lot of additional data in there, but already we can see water levels, flood categories, rain that's occurred, rain that's forecast, etc., and some other conditions as well, and a lot of different ways to view. Additionally, you can, any given dot on the map, you can drill down and link to our gauge database as well. Also, the flood inundation mapper, I'd mentioned, that we were involved in that. We don't have as many sites in the flood inundation mapper as we do stream gauges in the country, but we're working in that direction. Right now, you see a whole lot of this stuff more in the eastern half of the U.S. And there's a lot of sites there in the Midwest. You see the little orange and yellow triangles there in Indiana, Illinois area. Those are areas that are actually up in minor or moderate flood category or something like that. And so those maps are essentially predicting or showing real world inundated conditions in real time. Another application we were starting to look into with Hurricane Ida, there was some potential levee breaches in the Golden Meadow levee in the downstream end of the southern areas in Louisiana. And essentially what we did is we couldn't get in there, couldn't get boots on the ground because the inundation of the levees and roadways in the area. So we were able to do some, we took some aerial imagery and we were able to go in and essentially geo-rectify the thing and sense from the imagery, pull off elevations at given locations. And we're really able to show, here we know the high water elevations to be this based on gauge data in the area, and we know the topography to be this, based on DEMs, et cetera, and we had SAR data, synthetic aperture radar, for elevation data. So we had some real good topography there, and we were able to go in and show that here's areas where these levees were likely breached or overtopped and subject to some damage. Looking at real-time water levels using cellular telemetry, trying to expand our capabilities there. Cellular doesn't work in all cases, but if you've got good network, it certainly has in some cases some benefits over, say, for example, ghost satellite telemetry. One of the a key example is a better ability to go in and communicate two-way with a gauge. Augmented reality mobile apps, again showing a what if. Here's a building, and we know that the height here or the depth here is such and such. So let's show basically a pseudo image that says this is what this thing's going to look like if it gets to 4.5 feet, for example. Partnering with National Oceanographic folks, NOS, and really doing a lot with their coastal monitoring. One of the things we're doing is we're putting in data in transects inland to seaward, getting transects going that way. In this case, it shows a pier, but this is also helpful in their monitoring of dune erosion and dune erosion forecasts, et cetera. They've got we like to call them little bacon strip forecasts, where they say that there's a probability at this given location all along the coast of this kind of erosion or that sort of erosion. Would have been nice if Athena was here to talk about this, because she was the brainchild, or this is her brainchild, excuse me, the real-time flood impact map. And what this does is it takes USGS real-time stream data, gauge heights, river levels, and it communicates equivalent conditions, in the neighborhood of that gauge. And so, for example, if this gauge reaches 8 feet, 10 feet, are there certain flood impacts that are going to occur at that location because of that flood height. And so, you see the little icons in blue down there. Is there a bridge that's going to become inundated at a certain level? Is there a roadway that's going to become closed or impassable at a certain level? Is there a park or something that's going to be inundated, or other facilities that might be adversely affected? And you can essentially get these things set up at a given site to where you know that a given water level or stream stage is going to affect you in a certain way. You can then, from this page, you see a little pop-up. There's a blue link to it right at the bottom of the pop-up where it says subscribe to Water Alert. Well, Water Alert, even though this feature, this real-time flood impact map, doesn't exist at all of our gauges yet, you can subscribe to Water Alert for any gauge. And what Water Alert does is it says, I want to know when, Muddy Creek at Anytown reaches 9 feet. And you subscribe, you tell it 9 feet at this gauge number, this location. And when that gauge reaches 9 feet, it's going to send you a text. It's going to let you know. Looking into hurricane evacuation planning and how can we better incorporate USGS stream data along hurricane evacuation routes? Do we have gauges, along certain routes? Do we have the right, real world elevations for these gauges? Can it tell us when a bridge is inundated, where a road becomes impassable, et cetera? And so we're looking to incorporate those better into hurricane evacuation planning. And that's pretty much the end of Athena's presentation. And once again, I'll take questions on anything for this last presentation.
Okay. Hari Dungle asks, can we get these PowerPoints presentations or in PDF format? I have his email address, and Karl, I can give you his email address if you'd like to send those to him.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you. Gene Robbins says, great presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Gene. And again, if you've got questions for Athena, you want to hear more about that real-time flood impact map or anything else that was in this letter, part of the presentation, that's Athena's email is right there as well.
Question from Kurt Zach. Does the measurement in high flow conditions with ADCP pose problems because of fast flow turbulences, etc.?
Well, I think that the larger issue might be air entrainment. This is a great photo because it kind of shows the choppiness of the water surface, and to the extent that maybe the transducer on the ADCP isn't submerged enough, you may get air entrainment on the face that can kind of muddy the signal a little bit. But generally, these boats are kind of designed to minimize that effect, and the position of the actual instrument is usually far enough down into the water that that effect is minimized. Additionally, the ADCP by nature has a blanking distance, of a few centimeters at least, maybe a little larger than that, but where it's actually not recording intentionally to let things kind of normalize, underneath the housing.
Jennifer Daywalt says, no questions, just a quick thank you for all you do. Being in a small town located on the west branch of the Brandywine in Modena, Pennsylvania, this info is always appreciated.
Glad to do what I do. Thank you.
Kurt Zach asks, could the ADCP replace the high flow measurement with weights / integrated depth measurements with flow meters?
Yeah, and we've been using ADCPs primarily for most of our discharge measurements at high flow and low flow, where it's higher than weightable. Even in a lot of weightable conditions, we've got smaller ADCPs that if you got enough depth to get it in there and not be adversely affected by the top and bottom blanks in the cross section. Yeah, we use ADCPs. That's really our bread and butter in terms of getting flow measurements. And they give us so much more data than the you mentioned the integrated with the kind of point verticals across the channel. Ones we've got continuity across the section, but we've also got a lot more velocity points in the vertical instead of what would typically be a 0.2 and a 0.8 fraction of the depth measurements of velocity. So it's a lot bigger picture in terms of both the cross section and in terms of the velocity mapping.
Kurt says, awesome, thank you.
Well, if nothing else, that's all I've got.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Karl. Really appreciate your time today and sharing this information with all of us.
Glad to do it. Thanks again for the invite.
All right, absolutely. All right, thank you, everyone. Have a good day.